Picture yourself walking into a grocery store in 1940. You might think you know what you're about to see, but here's the thing. It wouldn't look anything like what we call a grocery store today, and I mean nothing like it. The entire experience, from the moment you walked through the door to the moment you left, operated on principles that would seem almost alien to us now. But before we get into how different it was, there's something crucial you need to understand first. Something that shaped every single aspect of how these stores worked. And it wasn't about the products or the prices or even the technology. It was about a fundamental assumption that nobody even questioned back then. Let me start with what happened when you walked in. You didn't grab a cart. In fact, shopping carts as we know them didn't really exist yet. There were some experimental versions being tested in a few places, but the vast majority of stores in 1940 had never seen one. You didn't need one anyway, because here's the first big difference. You weren't going to be walking around picking things off shelves. When you entered a typical grocery store in 1940, you were entering what was essentially a warehouse with a counter. A long counter that ran along one side of the store, sometimes along multiple sides. And behind that counter stood the grocer or his clerks. Between you and them was an invisible but very real boundary. You stayed on your side. They stayed on theirs. Now, you might be thinking this sounds inefficient, and you'd be right to wonder about that. But there's a reason this system existed, and once you understand it, everything else about how these stores operated starts to make sense. The products you wanted, the canned goods, the flour, the sugar, the coffee, they were all behind that counter, stacked on shelves that went up to the ceiling, organized in ways that made sense to the grocer, but not necessarily to you. You couldn't see most of what was back there. You couldn't compare brands easily. You couldn't pick up a can and read the label. So how did you shop? You told the grocer what you wanted, out loud, item by item. Think about what that means for a moment. You're standing there, probably with a list you wrote at home, and you're reciting it to another human being. I need a pound of flour, a can of tomatoes, some coffee. And the grocer or his clerk is writing this down, then turning around to fetch each item from the shelves behind him. But here's where it gets interesting. And here's that fundamental assumption I mentioned earlier. The grocer didn't just fetch what you asked for, he decided what you got. Let me explain what I mean. You ask for coffee. But there are 6 different brands of coffee on those shelves behind him. There's the expensive brand, the cheap brand, the medium-priced brand. There's the coffee that came in last week and the coffee that's been sitting there for 3 months. And you, standing on the other side of that counter, you have no idea which is which. The grocer reaches back and grabs one. Maybe it's the one he thinks you can afford. Maybe it's the one he needs to move because it's getting old. Maybe it's the one that gives him the best profit margin. Maybe if you're a regular customer and he likes you, it's genuinely the best one he has. You don't get to choose. You trust him to choose for you. And this is the fundamental assumption. Trust. The entire system ran on it. You trusted the grocer to give you good products at fair prices, to not cheat you on weight, to not sell you spoiled goods. And that trust wasn't just nice to have. It was absolutely essential because you had no other choice. Now, this might sound quaint or old-fashioned, but stay with me because there's a darker side to this that nobody talks about much. What happened if you were a customer the grocer didn't like, or didn't trust, or thought couldn't pay? What happened if you were the wrong color, the wrong religion, the wrong anything? The grocer had complete control. He could give you the worst products, overcharge you, refuse to serve you entirely. And there was often very little you could do about it, especially in smaller towns where there might only be 1 or 2 grocery stores. But let's get back to the mechanics of how this worked, because there are more layers to this. While the grocer is gathering your items, something else is happening. He's keeping a running total in his head or on a piece of paper. Remember, most items didn't have prices marked on them. The grocer knew what things cost. You didn't. Not exactly. Sure, you might know roughly what a pound of butter should cost, but prices could vary from day to day, week to week, and the grocer had some flexibility. If you were a good customer, someone who paid their bills on time, someone he wanted to keep happy, he might give you a better price. If you were new, or if you'd been late paying in the past, the price might be higher. And this brings us to another crucial difference: credit. Most people in 1940 didn't pay cash for their groceries. Not immediately, anyway. The grocer kept a ledger, a big book where he recorded what each family bought and what they owed. You'd come in weekly, sometimes more often, and you'd get your groceries. The grocer would write down what you took and add it to your tab. Then, once a week or once a month, depending on when you got paid, you'd settle up. You'd pay what you owed, and the slate would be wiped clean, or mostly clean. Some families carried a running balance, always owing something. This credit system was absolutely central to how grocery stores worked. It meant the grocer needed to know his customers, really know them. He needed to know if they were good for the money, if they'd pay eventually, if they could be trusted with 30 days of credit or 60 or 90. And this knowledge, this relationship, it cut both ways. The grocer knew what you bought. He knew if you were buying more than usual, which might mean you had guests coming or maybe that you'd come into some money. He knew if you were buying less, which might mean you were struggling. He knew your habits, your preferences, your financial situation. In a small town, the grocer was one of the most powerful people around. He knew everyone's business, literally and figuratively. But let's talk about the products themselves for a minute, because that's another area where things were radically different. When you asked for a pound of flour, the grocer didn't grab a prepackaged bag. Most products didn't come prepackaged. They came in bulk. Big barrels of flour, sugar, coffee beans, wheels of cheese, slabs of butter, and the grocer measured out what you needed. He'd take a scoop, dump flour onto a scale, adjust until he had exactly a pound, then pour it into a paper bag. He'd cut a slice of cheese from the wheel, wrap up butter from the big block. This meant every transaction took time, real time. If you had a list of 20 items, you might be standing at that counter for 20 minutes, half an hour, while the grocer measured and weighed and wrapped. And here's something most people don't realize. This measuring process was another place where trust came into play. Was that really a pound of flour? Was the grocer's thumb on the scale? Were you getting what you paid for? Most grocers were honest. They had to be, because their reputation was their business. But the opportunity for small dishonest was always there. Now, while all this is happening, other customers are waiting. There's probably a line forming behind you. And this is where the social dynamics of the 1940 grocery store get really interesting. Who got served first wasn't always about who arrived first. If the grocer's best customer walked in, the one who bought the most, who always paid on time, who'd been coming to his store for 20 years, that person might get bumped to the front of the line, and everyone else just accepted it because that's how things worked. There was a hierarchy, an unspoken set of rules about who mattered more. But let's think about what this system meant for the housewife. And it was almost always the housewife doing the shopping. Shopping for groceries in 1940 was a major time investment. You couldn't just run in, grab what you needed, and run out. You had to wait. You had to interact. You had to negotiate, in a sense, even if that negotiation was unspoken. And you had to know what to ask for. You couldn't browse. You couldn't discover new products easily. If you didn't know something existed or didn't think to ask for it, you didn't buy it. This meant that most families ate the same things week after week, year after year. Your mother bought what her mother had bought. You bought what you'd grown up eating. Innovation in the home kitchen happened slowly because discovery happened slowly. Now there were some products you could see. Some stores had a few shelves on the customer side of the counter with items that were already packaged, maybe some canned goods, some packaged crackers. But even these you typically didn't just grab. You asked the clerk to get them for you. And here's a detail that might seem small but actually reveals something important. Many stores didn't let women serve themselves at all. Even the items that were theoretically accessible on the customer side, you were expected to ask for them. A woman reaching across to grab something herself was considered improper, forward, not quite respectable. The grocery store in 1940 reinforced social norms in dozens of little ways. Let's talk about variety for a moment, because this is another area where the difference is stark. A typical grocery store in 1940 might stock 500 to 1,000 different items. A modern supermarket stocks 30,000 to 50,000. Think about what that means. Think about how much choice we have now that simply didn't exist. If you wanted tomatoes, you might have 2 or 3 brands of canned tomatoes to choose from. Not 12, not 20, 2 or 3. And remember, you weren't choosing anyway. The grocer was. This limited variety was partly about space. Stores were smaller, but it was also about the distribution system. Products came from regional suppliers, local dairies, nearby bakeries. National brands existed, but they weren't dominant the way they are now. Most of what you bought came from within 100 miles of where you lived. And this meant that what was available changed with the seasons much more than it does now. Fresh produce especially was only available when it was actually in season locally. You couldn't get fresh tomatoes in January unless you lived somewhere warm. You ate what was growing, or you ate what had been preserved, canned, pickled, dried. The grocer knew the rhythms of the seasons. He knew when the first strawberries would arrive, when the last of the apples would run out. Shopping was tied to the calendar in ways we've completely lost. Now let's talk about something that might seem mundane, but actually gets to the heart of why this system worked the way it did. Inventory management. The grocer had to know exactly what he had in stock. He couldn't just assume that because someone might want something, he should carry it. Storage was limited. Refrigeration was expensive and not always reliable. Many products, especially fresh ones, went bad quickly. So the grocer ordered carefully. He knew his customers. He knew Mrs. Johnson bought 2 pounds of coffee every week. He knew the Smith family came in every Friday for a roast. He could predict with reasonable accuracy what he'd need for the week. And this prediction, this knowledge, it was valuable. It was expertise. It was what made a good grocer good. But it also meant that if you wanted something unusual, something the grocer didn't normally stock, you might be out of luck. Or you'd have to special order it, which meant waiting, maybe a week or more. The grocery store served the community it knew. It didn't try to serve everyone or stock everything. It served its customers, the specific people who walked through its door. Here's something else worth understanding. The relationship between the grocer and his suppliers was completely different, too. The grocer didn't order from massive centralized warehouses the way modern stores do. He ordered from salesmen who came to his store, traveling salesmen representing different companies, different products. These salesmen would visit weekly or monthly, take orders, maybe try to talk the grocer into stocking something new. And the grocer had relationships with these salesmen, too. Trust again. Mutual obligation. The salesman would sometimes extend credit to the grocer, just like the grocer extended credit to his customers. The whole system was built on these personal relationships, these webs of trust and obligation. When a shipment arrived, the grocer inspected it carefully. If something was damaged or spoiled, he'd send it back. He had to, because he was putting his reputation on the line every time he sold something. If Mrs. Johnson bought eggs that turned out to be rotten, she'd blame him, not the supplier she'd never met. Quality control happened at the store level, by the grocer himself. Now let's talk about prices again, because there's more to this story. In 1940, many states had something called fair trade laws, or resale price maintenance laws. These laws allowed manufacturers to set minimum prices for their products. The grocer couldn't sell below these prices even if he wanted to. Why did these laws exist? Partly to protect small grocers from being undercut by larger stores that could afford to sell at a loss to drive out competition. The laws were meant to keep things fair, to prevent monopolies, to protect the little guy. But they also meant that price competition was limited. You couldn't really shop around for better prices on the same brand of a product because the price was the same everywhere. So competition happened in other ways. Service, credit terms, the quality of the produce, how quickly the grocer could fill your order, how nice he was, whether he'd deliver to your house. And delivery was a huge part of the business for many stores. You could call the grocer, if you had a phone, and read your list over the phone. He'd fill the order, and a delivery boy would bring it to your house that afternoon, sometimes the same day, sometimes the next. This service was often free or very cheap, especially for good customers. It was part of how you kept people loyal. Think about the economics of that for a minute. The grocer was paying someone, usually a teenage boy, to spend time delivering groceries to people's houses. He was absorbing that cost as a normal part of doing business. He could do this partly because his overhead was lower in other ways, but also because the entire economic structure was different. Labor was cheaper. Time moved slower. Efficiency, at least the kind of efficiency we value now, wasn't the primary goal. Let me tell you about something called trading stamps, because this was a big deal in 1940, even though most people today have never heard of them. Many grocers gave out trading stamps with purchases. You'd buy your groceries, and the grocer would give you stamps based on how much you spent. You'd take these stamps home, lick them, yes, lick them, and stick them in a book. When you filled the book, you could redeem it for prizes, dishes, small appliances, household goods. This was loyalty before we called it that. This was how grocers competed when they couldn't compete on price, and people took it seriously. Housewives collected these stamps religiously. Some people chose which store to shop at based entirely on which stamps they gave out and what prizes they wanted. It seems quaint now, but it was a significant part of the shopping experience. Now I want to circle back to something I mentioned earlier because it's important and it connects to a broader point about what was really changing in 1940. This system I've been describing, the counter service, the credit ledgers, the personal relationships, this was already starting to fade in 1940. It was still dominant, still how most Americans shopped, but the future was arriving. The first true supermarket had opened in 1930. By 1940, there were a few hundred scattered across the country, mostly in larger cities. And they were revolutionary. No counters, no clerks gathering your items. You walked in, grabbed a cart, they had carts, and you picked out your own groceries. Everything was pre-packaged, prices were marked. You could browse, you could compare, you could choose, and the prices were lower, sometimes dramatically lower. The supermarket model worked because of volume. Sell more for less profit per item, but make it up in quantity. Cut labor costs by making customers do the work of gathering their own items. Reduce losses from credit by requiring cash payment. It was more efficient, more impersonal, more anonymous, and it was coming, though most people didn't know it yet. The grocer with his counter and his ledger book and his personal relationships, he was already a figure from the past, even if that past was still very much the present in 1940. But here's what gets lost when we talk about this transition. When we celebrate the efficiency and lower prices of the supermarket. The old system did things the new system couldn't do. It provided credit to people who needed it. It created community. It gave people without cash access to food. It knew its customers not as numbers but as neighbors. Mrs. Johnson's husband died, and suddenly she's struggling. The grocer knows. He extends her credit. Lets her run a tab longer than he normally would. Slips a little extra into her bag sometimes. The supermarket doesn't do that, can't do that, isn't designed to do that. The efficiency comes with a cost. We gain something enormous when we move to self-service, to pre-packaging, to modern supermarkets. We gain choice and lower prices and convenience. But we lost something too. We lost a certain kind of relationship, a certain kind of community knowledge, a certain kind of mutual obligation. I'm not saying the old way was better. It wasn't, not overall. The power imbalances were real. The potential for discrimination was real. The inefficiency was real. But it's worth understanding what the trade-off was. It's worth recognizing that when we talk about how grocery stores worked in 1940, we're not just talking about a different way of buying food. We're talking about a different way of organizing community relationships. The grocery store in 1940 was a social institution in ways that go far beyond what we mean when we call a modern supermarket a community gathering place. Let me paint you one more picture before we wrap this up. It's a Saturday morning in 1940. The grocery store is busy. There's a line of customers waiting at the counter. The grocer and his two clerks are moving quickly, measuring, weighing, wrapping, writing in the ledger. Mrs. Peterson is first in line. She's been coming to this store for 15 years. The grocer knows she likes her coffee strong, her cheese sharp. He knows her husband works at the factory and gets paid every other Friday. He knows her oldest son enlisted last month, and she's worried. He fills her order efficiently, asks about her son, gives her a good price on the coffee because he knows money's tight, with one less income in the house. Next is a family that's new in town. The grocer doesn't know them yet. He's polite but cautious. Doesn't offer credit, not yet. Needs to see if they're good for it. Charges full price. They pay cash and leave. Then comes Mr. Chen. The grocer stiffens slightly. Serves him, but not warmly. Gives him the old produce, the coffee that's been sitting longest. Overcharges just a little. Not enough for Mr. Chen to argue about it, but enough. This is the reality of the 1940 grocery store. All of it. the community support and the discrimination, the personal service and the personal bias, the trust and the vulnerability. The supermarket, when it fully arrived in the decades after 1940, changed all of this. It made shopping more democratic in some ways. Everyone got the same products at the same prices, regardless of who they were or who they knew. But it also made it more anonymous, more transactional, less human. Understanding how a 1940 grocery store really worked means understanding that it wasn't just a different business model. It was a different social model, a different way of being in community with each other. And maybe that's the real insight here. The way we buy our food shapes the way we relate to each other. The grocery store isn't just where we get groceries. It's where we enact our values about fairness, about community, about who deserves what and on what terms. When we moved from the counter-service grocery to the self-service supermarket, we weren't just changing how we shopped. We were changing the fundamental structure of everyday social life. The grocer behind the counter with his ledger and his scales and his discretion, he's gone now. The system he represented is gone. And we should understand what we gave up to get here, even as we acknowledge what we gained. Because the story of how a grocery store worked in 1940 is really the story of a world where every transaction was personal, where trust was currency, where community and commerce were inseparably intertwined. That world is gone. And sometimes in the fluorescent aisles of a modern supermarket, surrounded by 30,000 products we can choose from ourselves, it's worth remembering what it was like when someone else did the choosing and knew your name.